Good evening, and welcome to the 2017 Public Lecture Series on the Wisconsin Idea, Past and Present. This lecture series is part of a course being taught under the auspices of the Department of Sociology at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. My name is Eric Sandgren. I am a professor at the School of Veterinary Medicine, and I have the honor to be the instructor for the course this semester. Students taking this for credit, please sign in. Also, students who are taking this for 1 credit, many of you I haven't met, and I'd like to have some kind of an event where we can go out and at least share pizza. I typically teach veterinary students, and so I can say, I'll buy the drinks and the pizza. You're mostly undergraduates, so I'll just buy the pizza. Drop me a line and tell me what might work for you, if there's a particular time before the lecture or after the lecture, in the middle of the day, on the weekend, I don't care. We'll figure something out. Anyway, so the Wisconsin Idea has always been about more than training students for the workforce. It meant, as Adlai Stevenson put it, a faith in the application of intelligence and reason to the problems of society. The aspiration to light the way of Wisconsin's citizens and government with the best torches of knowledge and understanding that their university can provide. Accordingly, this lecture series and the course with which it is associated aim to bring students, staff, and faculty in the UW system into a broad conversation with the citizens of the state about how the knowledge produced at the University of Wisconsin has benefited the public in the past and continues to do so today. I encourage you to participate actively through our course website at www.wiscidea.com. The Sociology Department is offering this course with limited resources. If you'd like to contribute to this project, please consider making a contribution to the Wisconsin Idea Foundation account. You can do so through the course website. We are fortunate to continue our series tonight with a lecture by Professor Adam Nelson. Dr. Nelson received his PhD from Brown University and is chair of the Department of Educational Policy Studies and professor of Educational Policy Studies and History at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. He works on the history of American education and higher education. His research has included projects on the history of radical and experimental education, the history of federal education policy, and the history of higher education in both the United States and Europe. He has numerous publications, and in 2015-16 served as president of the History of Education Society. Like all of our speakers, he is graciously donating his time and expertise free of charge and out of a commitment to public service. Please join me in welcoming Adam Nelson.
Thanks very much. I'm really happy to be here and to have the opportunity to participate in this great series of lectures on the Wisconsin Idea. I've had a number of opportunities because of my area of expertise, the history of higher education, to talk about the Wisconsin Idea and land-grant universities in lectures both in the United States and around the world. And when I'm abroad, I'm always struck by how many people have heard about the Wisconsin Idea. But as people in this room have been learning and discussing this semester, there are lots of ideas about the Wisconsin Idea. And so the opportunity to talk about the many variations on that theme is one of the things that I think makes the series exciting and makes being at this university really exciting. So tonight I'm going to look back at the history of the land-grant university and the origins of the Wisconsin Idea. And for those of you who were here for the first lecture given by Glenn Drury, consider this lecture that I'm about to give a prequel. In a way, I want to set the stage for a lot of the stories that Glenn introduced in that very first terrific lecture for this series. And I want to look back to the middle of the 19th century and consider the ways in which the emergence of land-grant universities introduced not only some solutions for American higher education, but some new problems, challenges, dilemmas, questions for the evolution of this system that we know today. Of course, the land-grant universities brought higher higher education to more students in more places than ever before in American history. This process of democratization, expansion, not only addressed some political concerns that had been swirling around higher education, but also introduced some new political debates about the role of the university in American society. When we provided access to higher education for more people and a wider variety of people, we had some new questions about the basic purpose of the university in our country. So my goal tonight is to get us thinking about why the Wisconsin idea emerged, when it did, and how it did in the United States and here in our state. So Gwen, in her very first lecture for this series, I thought set things up beautifully by talking about this perfect storm and the many forces that were in play in the country in the late 19th and beginning of the 20th century. And in a way, one aim of Gwen's lecture, as I heard it, was to disentangle the idea of the Wisconsin idea from the broad history of the land-grant university. One of my goals tonight is going to be to stitch those two things back together. So, we also heard in that lecture about the Wisconsin idea under Follette, Charles McCarthy, and others, representing a way of standing up to corporate power, linking public interests to the story of progressive social reform. Variations on this theme of democratizing the role of the university. Tonight, I'm going to take that theme and develop it in a different way by telling this story of a prequel to the Wisconsin idea that emerges in a crystalline form in 1912. Because one of the things I want to do is to suggest, partly as a provocation, that the emergence of the Wisconsin idea was not just an expression of progressive democratization in American higher education, but was also, in some ways, a response to, and perhaps even a reaction against, certain forms of progressive or populist democratization that preceded the progressive era in which the Wisconsin idea emerged. So that's a little teaser about where this whole lecture is going. I'm hoping it will elicit some questions as we get along here. So, to begin, I'm going to tell a prequel of the emergence of the land-grant universities. And I'm going to frame my comments around three questions for this lecture. One, who should attend the university? A question that Americans were asking themselves in the middle of the 19th century. What kinds of issues should the university's scholars pursue in their research? And how should the university promote social reform? Should it promote social reform? We've had lectures and Q&A. I've had a chance to look over the lectures for the series so far about objectivity, about politics and research, about the role of the university in social change. And finally, my lecture is going to end with some questions, some very difficult questions that emerged in the late 19th century about university governance and academic freedom. Who should decide the answers to questions 1, 2, and 3? And how did they do that? So my lecture is going to follow a basic chronology here. The land-grant universities emerged in 1862 with the Morrill Act, and we'll get to that. But I'm going to say a little bit about what happened even before that, then talk about the Morrill Act, and then talk about what followed the creation of the land-grant universities, ending up after the turn of the 20th century. So, to start this story, one might look at institutions like the Farmers College that was founded in Cincinnati in 1846. And this institution emerges in the context of a lot of reform in American higher education. The very next year, Harvard and Yale added scientific schools to their institutional apparatus. At Harvard, it was called Lawrence Scientific School. At Yale, it was called the Sheffield Scientific School. And this was a way of sort of appending certain kinds of applied scientific research to a traditional college that had taken on quite a bit of scientific work in the first part of the 19th century, but very little applied science within the college. So these kinds of institutions then gained some momentum, they gained some attention, and by the 1850s, before the Morrill Act, we had various states getting on to the trend wave and founding various agricultural colleges with state support. In the 1850s, we see Michigan State Agricultural College. There was the New York State Agricultural College. Maryland had an agricultural college. California founded its agricultural college, all supported by state revenues. And the idea was that these institutions would make agricultural research as well as industrial research more scientific and therefore more productive. Now, sometimes people assume that these new institutions were founded by the farmers themselves. But in fact, the institutions were almost always founded by middle-class reformers based in cities who thought that they could educate a new breed of scientists to pursue research and teach the farmers and the mechanics new techniques. Keep this point in mind, this issue of social class and the remaking of the university, because it will help to explain some of the controversies that surround the story I'm about to tell. So, as you saw from the previous slide, a lot of the institutions focused on agricultural research. Others were focusing on industrial and engineering sciences. In 1851, the Rensselaer Institute, Rensselaer School, founded in the 1820s, updated its civil engineering program, becomes the Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute, and one of the leading institutions of its kind. Later on, in Philadelphia, the Franklin Institute, also founded back in the 1820s, updated its program with new engineering courses, and expands considerably in the middle of the 19th century. The Sheffield School at Yale started to realize that already, less than a decade after its founding, it was falling behind as other institutions were creating new programs and expanding its programs in mechanical engineering as well as industrial chemistry. So, the leader of the Sheffield Scientific School at Yale was Daniel Coit Gilman, who had graduated from Yale College in 1852. And after that, he spent time abroad in Germany and Russia. Specifically, he was the secretary to the American ambassador to St. Petersburg during the Crimean War. The war between Russia and Europe's great powers who were aligned with the Ottoman Empire. Now, while he was abroad, Gilman visited a lot of different scientific institutions. And I know that in previous lectures, people have referred to the influence of European, especially German higher education, on American higher education in the middle of the 19th century. And it would be hard to overstate that influence. Gilman was convinced that the United States, in order to compete in a globalizing economy, we think maybe today is the first day of economic globalization, but in a globalizing economy, the United States needed to develop its capacity for scientific research. And he was not the only American to reach this conclusion. A lot of Americans who had studied abroad came back and said, we need to catch up. So one of the people at Yale who was helping Daniel Coit Gilman update the institution was James Dwight Dana. Now, Dana had graduated from the Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute. So he knew about sort of the cutting edge of what institutional reform might look like in these scientific institutions. After he attended Rensselaer, Dana joined a very famous round-the-world scientific expedition in the 1840s. The so-called U.S. Exploring Expedition was the first circumnavigation of the globe sponsored by the federal government of the United States. And they collected all kinds of materials and samples and specimens that eventually laid the foundation of the Smithsonian's collections in Washington, D.C. So Dana was part of that whole enterprise. And when he came back, the expedition took place in the 1840s, came back and in the 1850s helped Gilman and their colleagues at Yale craft a plan, which they called a complete organization of the School of Sciences connected with Yale College. And he said in 1856, our country is now ready for the establishment of a School of Science. The studies pursued in the best institutions of Europe have been carefully considered in reference to our educational establishments and the wants of our country. So the United States, he says, is finally ready for a modern, comprehensive research university. All of this is happening before the Morrill Act, before the creation of the land-grant universities. Meanwhile, Harvard, never to be outdone by Yale, is thinking about what reforms it might take on. And one of the people who's just coming out of Harvard College is Charles William Eliot, graduated in 1853 as a student of chemistry. And he noted that all the fun science was going on at the Lawrence School, connected to Harvard College. He says, in the Harvard College of my undergraduate days, there was no laboratory instruction given to the students. Eliot studied most of his chemistry out of books. The labs are all over there at Sheffield, and he's a student there at Harvard College. But during his junior year, a small laboratory was built in University Hall, and a professor of medicine, Josiah Parsons Cook, offered to buy the equipment to supply this lab. I don't want to give the impression that this was the first ever chemistry lab at Harvard, but it was the first attempt to really bring new kinds of applied scientific research into Harvard College. 13 years later, Eliot became president of Harvard and vowed to make the institution a research university. Now, calls for this new type of institution were gaining momentum by the end of the 1850s, carried along by the forces of industrialization. The demand for more scientists, better trained scientists, who could pursue both pure and practical research was growing as the United States realized that its competitiveness in, again, a globalizing economy hinged on the training of a new cadre of scientific leaders. But just when it seemed that all of the pieces were falling into place for an educational breakthrough, an even greater change occurred in the United States. The Civil War. Terrible event, the deadliest war in American history. It's important to note that the war killed roughly 10% of all Northern men and 30% of all Southern white men between the ages of 18 and 42. College enrollments, students off to the battlefield. The Civil War disrupted the momentum that I've been describing so far. But it also prompted a major leap forward. In 1862, as you know, Congress passed the Morrill Act, right in the middle of the war. And the idea, as I'm sure you all know, was to use the money from the sale of federal lands in the West to create new universities run by the states. How did the United States get these Western lands that it sold to create these universities that we're sitting in right now? Of course, this land had belonged to the native peoples of the West. From the 1840s through the 1890s, the United States federalized millions of acres, either by treaty or by force. and seized these lands from the Indians whose families had lived on those lands for centuries. This point is crucial. The land that funded the land-grant universities was not empty, it was not unoccupied, it was federalized and taken from its native inhabitants. Under the Morrill Act, not in an instant of the Morrill Act, this had been a project of decades, but under the Morrill Act, the new land-grant universities were supposed to focus on agricultural, mechanical, and military education. Why military education? Because, of course, we're in the middle of the Civil War. And the southern states are not represented in Congress. So the northern states have an opportunity to bolster their military strength through science and technology, and in a sense, looking forward not only for a war that looks like it's going to be a long haul, but to a post-war period, gave themselves Western land to institutionalize science and technology to win the war as well as the peace. They laid a foundation for economic growth after the war. And the land-grant universities played a major role in post-war agricultural and industrial development, as well as the reunification of the United States. The man behind the Morrill Act was Vermont Senator Justin Morrill, who believed very strongly that government had a key role to play in facilitating and regulating and orchestrating economic growth. Morrill is famous for the Land Grant Act, but he's equally famous as an advocate of very high tariffs to protect American industries from overseas competition, talking about a globalizing economy and various strategies to make the nation competitive. And of course, he calls not only for federal investment, but also for state investment in higher education and research. Now, Morrill didn't just dream up the idea of the Land Grant Act during the Civil War. He first proposed the idea before the war in 1858, and won support from people like Daniel Coit Gilman at Yale, who had just returned from his trip to Europe in the middle of the 1850s, and like Senator Morrill, called for state aid to scientific research at schools like Yale. 4 years later, after the first introduction of the idea, Gilman supported Yale's application for Morrill Act funds to support the Sheffield School. The application succeeded. Gilman was thrilled. Actually, I will just note really quickly. Eventually, this is a map of, and I'll get to the 1890 Act in a second, where the 1860 institutions, 1862 land-grant institutions were eventually founded. Of course, they emerge over the course of several decades and are given federal land to support their enterprises. And some people are unaware that universities we now think of as private receive Morrill Act funds in substantial amounts. I've just listed a few: Yale, Brown, Purdue, MIT, Dartmouth, etc. More on them in a minute. Just so people are aware that the land grant idea is an evolving idea in the late 19th century. So Gilman is thrilled to get Morrill Act funds for the Sheffield School, but his celebration was short-lived, because almost immediately, some people argued that Yale should use its new funds to make its curriculum, Yale College then should use some of these funds, to make its curriculum less classical and less elite, much more practical, more accessible to farmers and workers. They wanted Yale as a total institution to be focusing less on pure research and more on practical, maybe even vocational education with these Morrill funds. But Gilman wasn't so sure that that was the purpose of the Morrill Act. he wasn't convinced that that form of democratization was really the intent of the Morrill Act, which is a disputed idea. He says, "We do not think it likely or desirable that land-grant universities, like Yale at this point, should train young men to go back and labor with the hoe or the anvil. They are, rather, to train men by scientific courses of study for the higher avocations of life, and especially to take charge of mines and manufactures, the construction of public works, and the conduct of scientific surveys." According to Gilman, the land-grant universities were supposed to educate leading scientific men, his words. They were designed not for the miners or manufacturers themselves, Gilman said, but rather for the managers of the miners and the manufacturers, the leading scientific men. Now, some people assume that the land-grant universities almost immediately, instantly, magically made higher education available not only to more people, but also to people from the lower social orders. But in fact, the vast majority of students who attended the land-grant universities in the 1870s, and the 1880s, and the 1890s, and you get the idea, came overwhelmingly from the higher social classes. They were the sons of businessmen, the sons of lawyers, doctors, and other professionals. In 1870, shortly after the Morrill Act really kicked in, owing to at first the war itself and then the immediate post-war confusion, Reconstruction, and so on. In 1870 at the University of Illinois, 92% of the students were from homes in the upper half of the economic spectrum, as measured by family wealth held in the form of either land or capital, other forms of capital. Among the students at the University of Illinois, the average student family had $19,965 of wealth. The average professor's family had $8,318 of wealth. Now, the average professor was also in the top half of the income distribution. So you get an idea of the level of wealth of students at the University of Illinois in the 1870s. Despite their wealth, the students in these early land-grant universities enjoyed free tuition. Or, in some cases where fees were charged, they often received waivers, exempting them from payment. Now, some people thought this was outrageous. Wealthy students attending the state taxpayer-supported university as sort of this wealthy set. And you had people saying, why don't we have more sons of farmers, more sons of mechanics at the University of Illinois? To which farmers and mechanics said, the University of Illinois is not offering a course of study that's particularly useful to the kind of work we want our sons doing on the farm or in this factory. And we have an interesting debate about supply and demand for what these land-grant universities were offering. One farmer who also happened to be on the Board of Regents at the University of Illinois, lamented the fact that rich students were taking advantage of the university and less wealthy students were not. But he said, it's strange to say, but the great industrial class for which this grant, the Morrill Act, was designed, have sat supinely by and allowed the professions to use the funds for their own achievement. Sort of an activist call to enroll, not necessarily met by increased demand. This example of higher education for the scientific elite played out at New York's land-grant institution, Cornell, in this period. There's no SUNY yet. No state university of New York in that form that's gaining a land grant the way Cornell did. We can talk about that in Q&A, why not? Cornell opens in 1868 with a large private endowment from Ezra Cornell, the telegraph magnate, but actually created this unique hybrid of private and public support. Cornell, like many of the land-grant universities, charged no tuition at the beginning, enrolling both men and women, also in innovation. Not a unique and totally unique innovation, but enrolling both men and women. And Cornell thought that in exchange for free tuition, both men and women would work to cover their expenses. They would tend the university gardens, supplying the university dining halls, cooking the food from those gardens, cleaning the university dormitories. But it wasn't long before the wealthy students got an exemption. One critic noted, "What good old Uncle Ezra founded for the benefit of the poor has been stolen by the rich." Now I'm wondering if some of this story sounds familiar. Sounds familiar. It's a narrative about the role of the university, the history of higher education, that is as old as the university itself. In my courses, we start with the medieval university, and I assure you this complaint occurred even then. The establishment of the early land-grant universities took place during an era of dramatic economic change, both rapid economic development and radical economic inequality. Much of this change had to do with new forces of market integration, related to the forms of globalization that I described earlier, but made possible by new technologies, notably railroads. Just to give you a sense of how quickly the technology is developing, 1830, the Baltimore and Ohio looked like that. 1854, just a quarter century later, we've got a completely different apparatus. A totally different apparatus that is only going to continue to change, innovate, and grow. You can see, I hope you can make out the different colors here. The green are railroads in 1850, just a decade later. An expansion of the railroad system that is integrating the economy. And this is integrating a national economy, and it in turn integrates a national economy into an international economy. The pace of change is bewildering for people who are experiencing this in this period. By 1869, of course, the railroads moved from coast to coast. That's the year after Cornell opened. And soon enough, plans were in place for a second transcontinental railroad. To sustain this pace of development, one railroad from coast to coast is not going to carry the traffic. Already plans are in place for a second railroad by the early 1870s. Unfortunately, the bank that was chosen to raise the money for the new railroad made lots of bad loans, real estate loans, eventually getting itself into very hot water, deeply into debt. In the fall of 1873, the bank that was going to lend the money for the second transcontinental railroad failed, and like bank failures in 2008, this bank failure caused a financial cascade. Panic spread throughout the country, quickly bringing down the financial system. And the result was the recession of 1873. A recession that had major political consequences. We could do lectures just about this, one of which is effects on the presidential election. 1876, Reconstruction is brought to a close. A famous compromise gives the presidency to Hayes in exchange for withdrawing federal troops from the South. Reconstruction ends, and the Gilded Age begins. Now, this crisis, this financial crisis of the 1870s affected American higher education and these land-grant universities. The recession understandably angered a lot of American citizens, especially farmers and workers who had lost their life savings when the banks failed. And the farmers and workers in the middle of the 1870s started to join new political organizations, new political apparatus, eventually would be coalescing into brand new political parties that forced huge changes in the partisan makeup of the American political system. They joined the National Farmers Alliance and Industrial Union, the Knights of Labor, the National Grange of the Order of Patrons of Husbandry, which had been established before the Recession, founded in 1867, but had 200,000 members in 1873. That fall, the Recession struck. 2 years later, the membership had more than quadrupled to 854,000. Now, in some places, the Grange had a direct effect on the governance of these land-grant universities. For example, in 1873, the Grange forced the governor of Kansas to dismiss the entire existing board of trustees for Kansas State and to accept, we might say demand, but accept the resignation of the president. A new president was brought in by the new government in Kansas, supported by the Grange, named James Anderson, who had a mandate for change in the university. Anger at the recession. Elite institutions under fire. What do we need to do for our state land-grant universities to make it responsive to the passion that is arising politically in a state like Kansas? Anderson got his marching orders. He abolished instruction in Greek and Latin and German and French and added 50 minutes a day of required labor on the campus farm or the campus workshop. In the spirit of dealing with recession through fiscal austerity, he cut the university's budget, scaled back building projects, ostensibly to make the campus appear more humble and welcoming to the sons of farmers and workers. He also reduced admission standards to the level of the average rural elementary school graduate. Students 14 years old, basic skills in reading, writing, and arithmetic came to the university. One of the questions I want us to be thinking about is, who should attend the university? How is that question shaping the development of American higher education? Now, in this era, it's important to note that most students were admitted to universities in two ways. Either by passing the university's own admissions test. So each university had its own admissions test, and you could sit for that test. Kansas State had a test, Harvard had a test. You would go to the local place that was giving that institution's test and hope to pass. Or you could go to the university by graduating from an accredited high school, recognized by the university for its academic quality. And high schools in this period are also growing. We have really the emergence of a mass high school system in this period, and high schools are competing to be good enough for their students to go on to the university. In Kansas, you didn't have to graduate from an accredited high school anymore. You could attend outright. Anderson simply ignored the standard procedures and welcomed those who showed up at the gate. Now, according to a professor who supported these reforms, Anderson was simply purging the university of, quote, a certain aristocratic air, a paper collar dignity, if you know the paper collars that look so stiff and uncomfortable from that period, a paper collar dignity that was perfuming the curriculum of our primary and high schools. Anderson wanted none of that. As president, he served for the next 5 years until the recession ended in 1878, and he was off to Congress. Meanwhile, the Grange was exerting its power elsewhere. In New England, for example, the Grange members called for land grant funds to be taken away from Yale and Brown and Dartmouth and given to new, separate, independent land grant universities. Rhode Island, New Hampshire, Connecticut universities. Eventually, this movement that had motivated the Grange coalesced into a new political party, the Populist Party, which emerged in 1887. Now, the Populist Party plays a huge role in the next part of my story. Membership is growing. Members are demanding access to higher education. One of the things that the Populist Party did 3 years after it came to power was to push for a second Morrill Act, which expanded the network of universities that received federal land grant funds. Membership in the party was growing right through the early 1990s, particularly after 1893, when a second major recession hit the United States. This one even worse than the recession that hit 20 years earlier. Again, it was the railroad industry that precipitated the crisis. And again, it was the farmers and the workers who suffered the most. Over the next 5 years, 15,000 businesses failed, banks closed, unemployment skyrocketed. The recession inspired this populist party to put up candidates for election in different state legislatures. And I want to bring us back to Kansas, just because there's always a sort of what's up with Kansas question, and it's fun to show that it's been around for a while. Following in the footsteps of President Anderson in the 1770s, or 1870s, the populists called for lower entrance requirements, reduced fees, wanting more students to attend college for free. Now, as we know, of course, again, low tuition mostly subsidized the rich, who still comprised the majority of college students. But this was considered a populist crusade to lower tuition or cut it altogether so that more students could have access to higher education. And more students did have access to higher education in Kansas. The university helped rural students by offering more remedial courses. Otherwise unprepared students were given the opportunity for entry-level training, even as some professors worried that the university would quickly slip down to the level of a high school. In 1895, 17% of Kansas State students took remedial courses. 2 years later, in 1897, after this next wave of reform, 65% of the student body enrolled in remedial courses. Massive democratization, new access to higher education, and a changing idea of what a university is. Now, let's get it over so slightly. A colleague of mine who's written, I think, the best book on populism in American higher education, Scott Gilman, has talked about the ramifications of these reforms. He says, by emphasizing access and vocational training, rather than research expertise and advanced learning, the populists illuminated the difficult choices facing state universities as they sought to define the goals of mass public higher education in a democratic society. And I have to give a shout out to Scott because a lot of the story that I'm telling tonight really is rooted in the book that he wrote about these issues. And I think it's so resonant with some of the debates that have endured since that time. I want to take my last section of the lecture here to move to this question about who then governs the university. Who decides who should attend the institution, what it should teach, and how it should engage in social reform. Now, at Kansas State, as the populists took control, they felt that they had a mandate to dismiss professors who disagreed with their politics. In 1897, 65% of the students are taking remedial courses. The populists, who now control the board of governors for the institution, fired professors who questioned these reforms, replacing them with like-minded faculty. Those were the paper-collared aristocrats who simply had to go. And the regents had a public mandate to do this. In the end, they got rid of nearly 40% of the faculty. Now, the principles of academic freedom that we might believe guide American universities today had not yet been codified in this period. So we don't want to look anachronistically back on this period and think, why didn't they? We have to understand, why did they act the way they did? Scholars were in this period not considered independent of public opinion. Academic expertise, the conclusions of research, were subject to popular review. The Board of Regents could suppress faculty scholarship if it produced disagreeable results. Debates over academic freedom were particularly contentious in the social sciences at a time when many scholars were studying the causes of economic dislocation, inequality, contention. And social scientists sometimes took on the responsibility of advising the government about possible reforms. Gwen very helpfully alluded to the famous case of Richard Ely here at the University of Wisconsin in 1894. Oops. This is just as those issues are unfolding at Kansas. And of course, Richard Ely had used his research to call for reform in Wisconsin's labor union laws, also suggested the possibility that public ownership of, railroads might prevent the sort of corruption that had led to 2 recessions. The state legislature, led by conservative business leaders in this period, accused Ely of radicalism. State legislators in Kansas had accused the faculty there of radicalism. State legislators were pounding for Ely's removal from the faculty. But unlike in Kansas, in Wisconsin, the Board of Regents defended Ely's right to express his views and said famously, it always bears repeating. In all lines of academic investigation, it is of the utmost importance that the investigator should be absolutely free to follow the indications of truth wherever they may lead, whatever may be the limitations which trammel inquiry elsewhere. I wonder where they meant. We believe the great state University of Wisconsin should ever encourage that continual and fearless sifting and winnowing by which alone the truth can be found. The idea here was that scholars should be allowed to conduct research independent of public opinion, even independent of political power. And herein, I will submit to you, lay a key step in the shift from a populist understanding of the land-grant university to progressivism, a step that would pave the way for the making of the Wisconsin idea. While the University of Wisconsin defended Ely, other universities didn't defend similar kinds of work. University of Chicago fired Ely's student, Edward Bemis, who had also recommended public ownership of the railroads. Bemis therefore went to Kansas State, where the populists welcomed his ideas, even if they were not necessarily committed to what we might think are modern ideas of academic freedom. Perhaps the most famous case of this period involves the issue of academic freedom at Stanford. In 1900, Professor Edward Ross gave a speech in which he opposed the immigration of workers from China on the grounds that their presence lowered the wages of American workers. Now, he supported what had been enacted as the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, which barred Chinese immigration. Just to be clear about what's going on here, Ross at Stanford opposed non-white immigrants. For this position, he won support from white-controlled labor unions. Ross won that support also because he advocated higher wages for workers. He thought those wages were being suppressed by Chinese immigration. And he opposed the railroad owners who wanted more Chinese workers. Now, this speech angered Jane Stanford, the wife of Leland Stanford, who had made his fortune in the railroad industry by employing thousands of Chinese workers. Mrs. Stanford, who looks there's a famous story about Jane Addams and her puffy sleeves being basically criticized by Tolstoy for the waste of fabric. Mrs. Stanford accused Edward Ross of discriminating against Chinese workers. Quote, all labor, she said, all laborers were equal in the sight of God. Since Ross had the support of the labor unions, she called Ross a labor radical, and even worse, in her opinion, a socialist. Now, Mrs. Stanford demanded that Ross be fired. Stanford's president, David Starr Jordan, kind of liked Ross, didn't want to fire him. Then Mrs. Stanford threatened to take away the endowment. And you gotta think about this. David Starr Jordan's the president, he's thinking, my goodness, matter of principle or property. He's having a difficult day. And he informs Ross that, quote, the matter of immigration she takes most seriously. She's for open immigration. The university, she thinks, should be a source of conservative opinion on this issue. Now, some thought that professors at privately endowed universities had more freedom than those at the public state land-grant universities like Kansas State. Ross's case raises some questions about that. In the end, Ross left Stanford for the University of Wisconsin. 6 other professors, nearly 20% of the faculty at the time, resigned in protest to show their support for Ross and their opposition to Mrs. Stanford. But while 6 professors resigned, almost all of the others said they supported his dismissal. So you might think, maybe there's solidarity among the faculty, solidarity among the scholars in behalf of academic freedom. But publicly, they said they supported his dismissal. Why did they do that? Some may have been coerced or threatened with dismissal themselves if they didn't support this move. But I think it's important to consider that despite this idea of academic freedom, through much of the nation's history, academic freedom has not been guaranteed. American universities often advise their professors not to express controversial views so that the university could maintain, of course, its funds, but also, they said, its public trust. Now, one professor put it this way in the year 1900. While freedom of thought is doubtless increasing in all our higher institutions of learning, yet it is probably true today that there is not a college or university in the country that would long tolerate an active and formidable advocate of serious change in the present social order. He would be required to go. The speaker goes on, this professor. The reason for his removal would not be avowed as opposition to intellectual liberty, but rather that person's own incapacity, as evidenced by his vagarious opinions. There is a norm, there's a middle of the road, there's consensus, and the university should represent it. In the end, this person says, the deans and the donors, ostensibly representing the public, call the shots. Thought is free so long as it is sound. And of course, the authorities have their own convictions in regard to what constitutes sound. Now, by the turn of the 20th century, American universities had a politics problem. Many scholars asked themselves how they could reclaim, maybe even recreate, the university's reputation for intellectual objectivity, impartiality. How can they regain an image of detachment, disinterestedness, as if they had ever had it at all? Would the public ever trust their judgment, their expertise? Or were they to be considered no different than the politicians and the business leaders? Fundamentally, we have a question here about the relationship between scholarship and politics. Could scholarship be connected to politics and social reform? Or was scholarship intended to be strictly neutral, nonpartisan? In an era when many people, including scholars themselves, wanted to link research to reform, they had to ask themselves, was this possible while also maintaining the reputation of disinterestedness and detachment in research? Of course, these questions elicited a great deal of debate. For now, I'll simply note that most universities in this period felt it was acceptable to fire professors for expressing partisan views, which meant, of course, views at odds with the party in power. Moreover, this approach applied equally to public and private universities. For on the one hand, you could think there's no escape. On the other hand, you could think this is a democratization of the university. I'd like to close with a few words about the emergence of the Wisconsin idea in this context. And say just a moment about Governor Follette, Charles McCarthy, and the progressives who codified these principles of the Wisconsin idea. These are political progressives who take on the big corporations, as Gwen so wonderfully outlined in the very first lecture for this course. Their goal is to fight corruption. Not only private corruption, but public corruption as well. Follette borrows the populist's emphasis on the common citizen. But he looks to experts to help solve the most difficult social and economic problems of an exceedingly complex, globalizing economy. He looks, of course, in particular to the University of Wisconsin. And as Gwen outlined, again so wonderfully, helps to set up the Wisconsin Legislative Research Bureau with Charles McCarthy's help, connecting university experts with legislative leaders to craft public policy. The emphasis on expertise. And I want us to think about that prequel to the story of the making of the Wisconsin idea and the context of populism as it changes into progressivism in the beginning of the 20th century. The idea was that in a democratic society, a public university should offer its scholarly help not only to people who lived in the urban centers, these urban elites, but of course to people in every part of the state who are interconnected in the predicament of a fast-changing economy. In 1912, when Charles McCarthy famously writes up his set of principles in the book, The Wisconsin Idea, he summarizes this link between people, the university, and the legislature. As he put it, in a modern democracy, the people must be given full power to make their actions effective. And at the same time, the educational institutions of the state must build up that capacity in such shape as to give the people the opportunity to learn how to use their power wisely. Here, perhaps, is one slice of the Wisconsin idea, the role of the university in bringing its research to the people of the state to have a big and often difficult discussion about how to use democratic power wisely. You can see the influence of populism in this account, in its emphasis on the people's power. But we can also see McCarthy's attempt to reclaim, maybe even recreate, intellectual expertise and its capacity to help solve exceedingly difficult problems. As the populist era gave way to progressive reform, the university became a leading player in the pursuit of social change. The establishment of land-grant universities raised some important questions. Who should govern the university? Trustees, professors, voters, the public at large. Who should govern the university, and how do those governance structures reflect our values about the university? What's the relationship between scholarship and politics? Should scholarship be connected directly, indirectly to social reform? Should it be neutral and nonpartisan? Is it possible to put these things together? We know in this period that I'm talking about that both public and private universities were subject to political control and manipulation. We often talk about where is the public in the public university? But we could also ask, where is the public in the modern university of the 20th century and the 21st century? I asked at the beginning who should attend the university, and we see in this period a step toward mass higher education, a progress that continues today. But of course, that process raised a lot of questions that had to be answered. Next, we talked about how land-grant universities raised questions about new research topics, practical research compared with peer research, generating a new cadre of scientists who could lead the process of economic change. But this, too, raised lots of questions about the relationship between research and reform. Finally, we talked about how the creation of land-grant universities, as they moved toward what becomes the Wisconsin idea in this state, raised hard questions about who governs the university. The populists wanted to put the people in charge, but the people didn't always respect the principles of academic freedom. The land-grant universities, therefore, have a challenge: how to balance the important elements of public control of the university with the preservation of academic freedom. This is a very delicate balance. It requires vigilance, sensitivity, very careful management. Some people might consider the idea of a democratic university or a democratized university an oxymoron. Contradiction in terms. But universities like this one, the University of Wisconsin, consider that ideal one worth pursuing. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Yes, we'll open it up now for questions. Are there any? All right.
Yeah, I'm interested in when the idea of academic freedom as the AAUP institutionalizes it gets institutionalized, gets widely accepted. Sorry.
That way the people who are watching online can hear too.
All right, so the question is, when does academic freedom get institutionalized as such? And what does the AAUP have to do with it, and what happens?
It's a great question. So the book, The Wisconsin Idea, is published in 1912, and the AAUP starts to codify the idea of academic freedom in 1915. Did I say 1812? 1912. Just 3 years later, in 1915, AAUP, the American Association of University Professors, comes together and sort of writes out a set of principles about academic freedom. Now, just because the AAUP set out these principles did not mean that a magic wand was waved and universities suddenly all adopted them and abided by them in the ensuing years. As we know, we've had waves of debate about academic freedom and the principles of the AAUP in the history of the 20th century American university. I assume most people are familiar with the post-World War II sort of revisiting of those issues during the McCarthy period, which in some ways made the events that I'm talking about here look like child's play in terms of their scale, scope, and severity. So this dance between sort of principle and practice around academic freedom is one that keeps going and must constantly be revisited, discussed, talked about, updated, even as we cherish some of the earlier principles. And learn about the history that led to those principles in the first place.
I have a question, kind of a follow-up to the one that just was asked. One of the advantages of studying history is that it does provide a certain context and perspective. In fact, that's one of the advantages of just getting older, that I can look back, and there are plenty of disadvantages, but that's an advantage. And I can maybe put current events into perspective. So I'd like you to put some current events, the issues, the concerns that are facing universities, and let's say particularly this university. We're one of the ones kind of on the forefront of some of the newer developments or pressures that seek to change things in certain ways. So where would you classify the current controversies, turmoil, if you will, in the scheme of things? So how big are the ups and downs that occur? Help us put this into perspective.
That's a really, really good question. It's also a hard question. One of the things that I enjoy about being an historian is the sense of distance from the issues that I'm discussing. And I'm sure you can tell from the way I construct lectures that, of course, I want them to resonate with the issues that we're facing today, and I want people to see some parallels. But there's never a perfect overlap between the past and the present. There's always subtle differences that make a big difference in the way we address these topics. One thing that I have thought a lot about when I look at earlier debates about academic freedom is that I talked just a second ago about principle versus practice. The idea of academic freedom is a social contract. It's not an absolute. It's not a universal. Although sometimes we talk about it in those ways. As an historian, I'm interested in the ways in which these principles are negotiated in new and different ways over time. And they require constant reflection and renewal in new circumstances. And so that doesn't mean, when I say it's a social contract, it doesn't mean that it's a purely pragmatic sort of enterprise where you find something that uniquely fits a particular moment and you go with that until circumstances change. Principle matters in those discussions. But when, for example, we look back on cases of academic freedom in the late 19th century, the middle of the 20th century, one of the things that I think is really interesting to notice is how those debates reflect broader, maybe even deeper social anxieties about rapid change. Whether it's demographic change, economic change, political change, they often, people need to make sense of change, they need to take positions about that change, and there is going to be significant disagreement. One of the issues that seems to be behind almost every big flare-up in debates about academic freedom is a renegotiation of the funding structure of the university. Where does the money come from? The public funds higher education, even in private universities, which derive so much of their resources from the federal government and federal research dollars and so on. The public has a vested interest in all of our universities. And it's a funding interest as well as a political and social interest, and an intellectual interest, and a humanistic interest, and so on. And the social contract that surrounds the debate having to do with academic freedom often seems to coincide with shifts in funding structures of universities, as people feel anxious about the resources that support what people inside the university feel that their work depends on, and people outside the university feel should, in fact, lead to benefits for society at large, that funding structure. And so I don't have a theory yet about exactly how the debates about structural changes in funding universities coincide with debates about academic freedom, but I have a feeling that it shapes the negotiation of that social contract in profound ways. The risk is that people will think dollar in, benefit out, and that there's a direct relationship between particular resources and particular outcomes. That would probably dismantle the meaning of the modern research university as something that is not necessarily leading to immediate practical impact in every aspect of its work. Because one of the things that's really important to note about all the universities I described today is that the research they were conducting, and other lectures in this series have touched on this, would have ramifications and benefits for decades to come in the future. And the investment in that process is one of the things that the public is constantly trying to figure out about the university. How does the university and the freedom that's needed to pursue research that will have practical impact decades in the future merit our investment and our support? That's a really difficult thing for a diverse population to coalesce around. That's a really, really big question. So it's not surprising that people have profound disagreements about it. And those disagreements often play out in debates about what kinds of research should be supported in the university. And those debates, in turn, play out in debates about academic freedom. What kinds of ideas are we supporting? What kinds of ideas are we funding? What kinds of ideas do we need? Not only in the short term, but in the very long term. And I think those things are connected.
Thanks, Adam. So you talked about public and private both being publicly funded. And you mentioned federal funding. I wonder if you would comment then on federal versus state funding and the geographical implications as opposed to just the sort of sector implications.
So, are you asking about the past or the present or both?
Only future. No. Yes, yeah.
Okay.
We'll go with the past. We'll go with the
Okay. So, in the period that I was discussing today, which is mostly the late 19th century, the standard narrative is about the emergence of privately endowed universities coinciding with the rapid growth of leading public universities. We're talking about the research university. These are the two sort of touch points in the narrative. What's happening to, how are we getting everywhere from Cornell to Johns Hopkins to Chicago and Stanford and so on. And then how are we getting the greats of Wisconsin and Michigan and Berkeley on the other hand. And there's this trope in the traditional sort of telling of that story about a public kind of university, or private kind of university, and a public kind of university. And even in this period, that dichotomy, I believe, is often overdrawn. Now, I wouldn't want to collapse it completely. It's important. But sometimes it's overdrawn. Your question specifically is about state resources and federal resources. And what's interesting about those two groups in this period is that there was a great deal of concern, or debate, I should say, about which source of funding had the most strings attached. Did public funding have more strings attached, or did private funding have more strings attached? And the answer wasn't obvious when it comes to supporting research. It was just not an obvious answer. And so in the period leading up to World War I, a lot of the private universities said sort of no thank you to government federal oversight. And so you had a very limited federal research apparatus leading up to World War I. That's not to say that federal resources hadn't flowed into universities. We've talked about the Morrill Act today. But generally an aversion to what they considered centralized control. And a great deal, in these private institutions, a great deal of faith that philanthropic support would sustain the research enterprise. Until World War, and a realization that perhaps the private philanthropy would not suffice for an overall national research infrastructure, as the war had demonstrated might be needed. And so in the 20s, with the emergence of the National Research Council and eventually other kinds of ways of organizing federal funds to universities, we have an increasing federal role in funding American higher education for the 20th century. And private universities and public universities by the 30s are participating in that, and then of course World War II changes the game profoundly. So one of the things I guess I would emphasize in answer to that question is that the federal role is never absent. The federal role is growing, but slowly in the first half of the 20th century, as merely state resources couldn't sustain the scale of the enterprise. And so I think that's an important, I'm going to jump to the present today, because we're talking again about how what the mix of resources should be to support a very complex, elaborate apparatus for research and education in the 21st century at the highest levels globally. And once again, it seems clear that the mix that we've been working with, state and federal, also private philanthropy and industrial support, needs to be rethought. And we're going through a process of rethinking that mix. And it's extremely contentious. It's so complex. But it is essential for thinking about the nation's position in a globalized, very competitive, globalizing economy and higher education marketplace itself. And if we don't figure it out, competition isn't going to stop, and we'll probably feel the effects of that. If we do figure it out, then some of our strength on the global stage can be sustained. I spent a lot of time talking about these issues in China, as I alluded to at the beginning, and I can assure you that these questions are absolutely at the top of the agenda in discussions about rapid growth in higher education elsewhere in the world.
We have time for one more quick question.
The College of Agriculture here, following the funding of 1887 from the Hatch Act and other money that came along lines, eventually by 1910 became a parallel College of Liberal Arts and Sciences, or Liberal Letters and Sciences. Can you comment on whether that was a reaction to the pushback from the populists and progressives that you had basically a standalone university here with a college that had rural sociology, ag econ, education, journalism, all these things far beyond animal husbandry and crops and that type of thing. I think the University of Illinois had similar things. I spent only 2 years there, but I thought they had rural sociology and ag econ and many of these other things. What role did, one, the funding of the Hatch Act, which gave 12-month contracts and reliable research money to the ag schools and not to the colleges of letters and science, and what roles did your populist thesis have to do with the expansion of the colleges of agriculture into these many fields in the social sciences?
That's a really, really good question. So, and I take it you're thinking specifically about the University of Wisconsin's evolution as an institution. So, the case of Kansas is one where populists exert tremendous influence. That influence is not replicated here in Wisconsin over the role that agricultural study plays in the university. So it never goes quite to the extreme that I described in the Kansas case. But what I appreciate about your question so much is the emphasis on the diversification of study and expertise and ways in which students are educated and trained for a rapidly changing economy. And that's an agricultural economy. The agricultural economy, in turn, is connected to all of the things that you listed. Everything from sort of the home economy all the way through journalism. I'm glad you included that too. So how are ideas communicated to broader audiences? How are students trained to teach biology and the biological sciences from the School of Education perspective, and so on and so forth. That diversification is something that's happening in all of the major research universities, especially the land-grant universities of the late 19th century. Oh my God, that's my own phone. I feel so embarrassed. Excuse me, because I just don't want it to keep ringing. Very sorry about that. That's like faux pas number 1 for a lecture. So you can see it's old technology.
That's the Smithsonian calling for the phone.
Definitely. That's a great suggestion. I can submit that as an artifact. So anyway, it just simply gives me an opportunity to emphasize how quickly that not only subject area diversification, research diversification, and resource diversification is changing these institutions as they grow from the perspective of the late 19th century incredibly quickly. One of the things that, from their perspective, seemed clear is that the university was becoming unmanageably large and complex. Now we look back and think of an institution that has 5,000, less than 5,000 students as quaint, almost a small liberal arts college. But from their perspective, it just seems impossible to contain. And we think today of the multiversity of the middle of the 20th century. Clark Kerr in the 60s says, there's no way to keep the faculty together except for disputes over parking. And the same feeling struck them even in an institution that looks to us small because of the scope and scale of the enterprise. And yet, and this is a point that's very much worth emphasizing, what McCarthy does in the Wisconsin idea and the emergence of a more robust extension program in the late 19th and early 20th century is say, the university is large and complex, and we can manage that. We can make the university even larger and more complex in its mission for the benefit of even more people. And people like Walter Lippmann, who are writing about the difficulty of rapid pace in social change in the early 20th century, are talking about whether these large institutions will lead to drift or whether they can be mastered. And he has this famous book, Drift and Mastered. One of the things he's asking himself is, how can institutions and their leaders not only corral these forces of change, but direct them toward progress and human welfare? And as a progressive, Walter Lippmann believes that that's possible, just as Charles McCarthy did in the same period.
Please join me in thanking Adam.